My name's David, I'm 46, and I live in Greenfield, Indiana. I guess you could say I always thought life had a twisted sense of humor. It's like you spend years trying to earn approval from the people you love the most, only to wake up one day and realize they were never rooting for you to begin with. The first cracks in the dam showed when I was just a teenager. My mom had always been the glue, warm, sharp-witted, the kind of woman who could make you feel like you mattered, even on your worst days. But when she died in a car accident when I was 16, everything came apart. And by everything, I mean my dad. He blamed me. Quietly, at first. Just these looks across the dinner table, this simmering disappointment. I was supposed to pick her up that night, but I begged off to go to a party. She drove herself instead and never came home. My dad, Alan, never said it outright, but his eyes did. And worse, his actions did. Enter Mike, my cousin. Mike's mom had died young too, and my dad, the generous uncle, decided Mike would basically replace me in every way that mattered. When Mike moved in with us, it was like a spotlight turned on over his head, and I disappeared into the shadows. Mike was the golden boy. Football star, easy smile, grades good enough to scrape by, but charming enough that no one cared. My dad funded every one of his dreams. Private coaching, new car, college applications, all of it. And me? I got a part-time job bagging groceries after school to cover my own sneakers. What gnawed at me back then wasn't even the money, it was the absence. The way my dad looked at Mike with this quiet pride, the kind I used to pray for. The way I became invisible under the same roof I'd grown up in. I remember sitting on the porch one summer night, hearing them laughing inside over a football scholarship letter Mike had gotten. And I just sat there, staring out at the streetlights, thinking, I'm never going to be enough for him. That thought lodged itself in me like a splinter. And I'd spend the next 2 decades trying to carve it out. After high school, while Mike headed off to Indiana University on Dad's dime, I stayed behind. Community college, night shifts, and a gnawing sense of failure became my companions. At first, I told myself I'd transfer to a university later, maybe once I proved myself. But reality has a way of grinding down your idealism. The money just wasn't there, at least not for me. My dad said things were tight, but somehow tight never applied when Mike needed a new laptop or wanted to join a study abroad program in Spain. I remember the day it hit me hardest. It was my second year of working at a hardware store in Greenfield. I was stacking shelves, covered in dust, when a customer came in, Mike, home for Thanksgiving break, all smiles and stories about Barcelona. He didn't even notice me at first. When he finally did, he gave me that grin, the one that said, "Man, look how far ahead I am." That was the night I stopped making excuses. I threw myself into work. Not just the job, life. I built a network of friends, the kind you choose, not the ones you're stuck with. I saved. I learned. I moved out of Dad's house into a tiny apartment with peeling paint, but a lock I paid for myself. And slowly, something shifted. I wasn't the loser scraping by. I was the man figuring it out on his own. And for the first time, the silence from home didn't sting. It felt like peace. But here's the twist. Success didn't look like what I thought it would. It wasn't a diploma or a fat paycheck. It was standing on my own 2 feet, knowing every inch I gained was mine. No one could say I owed them a thing. It was late October when the phone rang. I remember it so clearly because I was sitting in my tiny kitchen, the one with the leaky faucet I hadn't gotten around to fixing, eating instant noodles out of a mug. That's when the screen lit up. Dad. I hadn't heard from him in almost 2 years. I just stared at the phone, thumb hovering over the screen, heart pounding. My first instinct was to ignore it, let it ring, let the past stay buried. But some old reflex, maybe the kid in me who still craved his approval, made me swipe and put the phone to my ear. What I heard wasn't the proud, dismissive father I remembered. It was a broken man. His voice was thin, strained, a shadow of itself. He stumbled over his words, talking about mistakes, regrets, how Mike had moved across the country and wasn't returning his calls, how the money was gone, how he didn't know what to do. For a moment, I didn't know what to feel. Sympathy? Satisfaction? Maybe both, tangled up in a knot of confusion. I sat there gripping the phone, noodles going cold, listening as this man who had never once called to say, "Good job," was now calling to say, "I need you." And here's the kicker, a part of me wanted to rush to his side. That old, stubborn loyalty surged up like a reflex I couldn't kill. But then another part of me, the part that had fought to stand on my own, whispered, "You owe him nothing." I didn't answer right away. I just sat there, letting his words wash over me, feeling the weight of years pressing down. And for the first time, I realized I held the power in this relationship. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I finally understood I didn't need his approval to be whole. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, watching the headlights from passing cars flicker across the cracked plaster. His voice kept echoing in my head. The regret, the desperation. The man who had once thundered through my life like a storm now sounded like a frightened old man lost in his own house. But here's the twist I didn't see coming. I wasn't angry. Not the kind of anger I'd carried through my 20s, the bitterness I'd fed like a stray dog. That anger had burned itself out long ago. What I felt now was something quieter, heavier. A kind of grief, maybe. Not just for what was happening to him, but for what we never were. In the morning, I called him back. Calm, steady, detached. He was surprised I'd answered. I could hear it in the way he exhaled too quickly, like he'd been holding his breath for years. He launched into apologies, long rambling explanations about how he meant well and just wanted what was best, and I let him talk. I let him pour it all out. And then, when the flood slowed, I told him the truth. I told him I was okay, that I'd built a life, that I had friends who were family, a job that gave me purpose, a home that might be small but was mine. And then I told him, softly, not cruelly, that I couldn't be the one to save him. There was a long silence on the other end. For a moment, I wondered if he'd hung up. But then he whispered, I understand. And you know what? I think, for the first time in his life, he did. About 2 weeks passed after that call. I honestly thought that was the end of it, like we'd quietly closed the last chapter on a messy book. I went back to work, back to the life I'd built brick by brick. But life, as I've learned, has a sharp sense of timing. One Friday evening, I came home to a letter jammed in my mailbox. No return address, just shaky handwriting I hadn't seen since my childhood. Inside was a note from Dad. It wasn't long, barely 3 lines. Just said he wanted me to know that Mike wasn't coming back, that the house was on the verge of foreclosure, and that he was sorry. And taped to the bottom, like some strange, final offering, was a yellowed snapshot of the 3 of us from a long-forgotten summer. Mom, Dad, and me. No Mike. Just the original 3. I sat on the front steps, the cold seeping through my jeans, staring at that photo until the streetlights flickered on. I remembered the day it was taken, a picnic at Fort Harrison State Park. I must have been 8 or 9, holding up a dripping popsicle, grinning like the king of the world. And my dad, back then, had his arm draped around my mom's shoulders like she was the sun, and I was the moon orbiting them. It gutted me. Not because I missed that man, that version of him had died with her, but because I realized how much time we'd all lost chasing shadows. I didn't sleep that night. I paced the apartment, the image of that photo burned into my mind. At one point, I even found myself halfway to the door, keys in hand, ready to drive over to his place. But I stopped, not out of coldness, out of clarity. Because here's what nobody tells you about betrayal. It isn't just the breaking that hurts. It's the way it rewires your heart. I could have shown up. I could have handed him a lifeline. But I would have been erasing every inch I'd fought for, every scar that shaped me. So I didn't go. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, the letter in one hand, the photo in the other, and I made peace with a truth I should have accepted years ago. I can love the memory of someone without setting myself on fire to keep them warm. 2 days later, I heard through a mutual friend that Mike had drained the last of the joint accounts Dad had set up, just in case, and ghosted him completely. Moved out west, chasing some startup dream with money he hadn't earned. Dad was alone, broke, and suddenly aware that the son he'd pushed away was the only one still standing. I thought I'd feel triumph, some cinematic surge of justice, but what I felt was smaller, sadder. Karma hadn't come with trumpets. It came like a whisper, slipping through the cracks of old regrets. And in that moment, I finally understood. Some debts aren't mine to pay, no matter how loudly the past comes knocking. A few days later, I got a knock at my apartment door. Not a phone call, not a text, an actual knock. I can count on one hand the number of people who ever show up unannounced, so I already had that sinking feeling in my chest before I even reached the door. And sure enough, there he was. My dad. He looked smaller. Not just older, smaller, like life had finally whittled him down to the shape he'd tried so hard to pretend he wasn't. His clothes hung loose, his eyes were sunken, and when he spoke, his voice barely made it past the threshold. He said he was sorry. Again, that things had gotten worse. That Mike was gone for good. That he didn't know where else to turn. I just stood there, fingers tightening on the doorknob, feeling a strange swirl of emotions. The child in me wanted to pull him inside, make him coffee, sit him down, and tell him it was all going to be okay. But the man I'd become knew better. I told him gently, firmly, that I couldn't help, that I wouldn't help. He stared at me for a long moment, and then something inside him crumpled. His shoulders slumped. His hands shook. And for the first time in my life, I saw the man behind the armor. Not the father who'd spent decades holding me at arm's length, but the lonely, wounded human being who didn't know how to fix what he'd broken. But here's the thing no one prepares you for. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away. So I did. I closed the door, not with a slam, not with anger, but with a quiet finality that even I didn't see coming. And I leaned against the door on the inside, heart pounding, tears stinging my eyes, wondering when exactly I had become strong enough to survive letting go. In the weeks that followed, something strange happened. At first, I braced for the guilt to hit me like a freight train. I thought I'd wake up in the middle of the night drowning in it, that every quiet moment would become a courtroom where I stood trial for being a bad son. But the guilt never came, not in the way I expected. Instead, I felt something I hadn't known in years, a kind of lightness. Not joy, not celebration, just the quiet removal of a weight I'd carried so long, I'd forgotten it was there. I started noticing things, like how I no longer flinched when the phone rang, how walking through my apartment felt less like retreating and more like returning home, how the friends I'd chosen over the years, the ones who'd become my real family, circled closer without asking questions, just showing up with laughter, cold beers, or a simple "you good, man?" It wasn't a perfect peace. Some nights, the past still rattled its chains. I'd catch myself wondering if my dad was eating, if the house was dark, if he ever replayed those years the way I did. And sometimes, in the quiet, that old ache would press against my ribs. But here's the truth I came to live with. Love isn't a debt. Family isn't an obligation you bleed yourself dry to meet. And I had bled enough. One night, sitting on my worn-out couch with my best friend Jason, I told him everything. The weight, the years, the decision to step away. I expected judgment. I expected him to tell me to call, to fix it, to be the bigger person. Instead, Jason leaned back, cracked open a beer, and said, "Man, sometimes the only way to win is to leave the game." That line lodged itself in my chest and stayed there. A month passed, then two. No calls, no letters. Through mutual friends, I heard the house went up for sale. That Mike never called back. That dad had moved into a small apartment across town. And you know what? That was his road to walk. As for me, I kept walking mine. I got a promotion at work, one I never even told Dad about because, for the first time, I didn't need his applause. I started dating someone, a woman named Sarah, who laughed at my worst jokes and didn't care about the shadows I carried. And I took deep, anchoring breaths in a life that was no longer defined by what I was owed or what I never got. It was a gray, drizzly morning in late spring when the letter arrived. No one sends letters anymore, right? That alone should have tipped me off. It was tucked between a pizza coupon and a utilities bill, a plain white envelope with my name written in a hand I hadn't seen in years. Inside was a letter from Mike. For a minute, I just stood there in my apartment, the coffee I'd been holding cooling in my hand, staring at his name. Mike, the golden boy, the cousin who'd inherited the best of everything and disappeared when it mattered most. His letter was strange. Not an apology exactly, but a confession of sorts. He wrote that things hadn't worked out west. The startup flopped. The money was gone. He'd burned every bridge, and now, broke and alone, he was realizing that maybe, just maybe, Dad hadn't done him a favor by handing him everything on a silver platter. He said he wanted to meet. Not to ask for help, he claimed, but just to talk. For 2 days, that letter sat on my kitchen counter, moving from one pile to another as I tried to decide what the hell to do. Part of me wanted to throw it away without a second glance. Another part, the stubborn, curious part, wondered if maybe this was the final knot in the tangled family mess that needed untying. In the end, I agreed to meet. We picked a neutral spot, a coffee shop halfway between our old neighborhood and where I live now. I got there early, sat by the window, and watched the rain streak down the glass. And when Mike walked in, for a second, I didn't recognize him. He looked ordinary. Not the star quarterback I remembered, not the guy who always walked into a room like he owned the air. He was thinner, a little hunched at the shoulders, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. And when he saw me, he gave this awkward, half-apologetic smile that told me he knew. He knew. The pedestal had crumbled. We talked. About small things at first, where we were living, what we were doing. And then about Dad. Mike admitted he hadn't called him. That when the money ran dry, he'd bailed, not out of cruelty, but because he didn't know how to face him. He said he envied me. Not the money, not the job, but the backbone, the life I'd built without anyone's help. And in that moment, something in me softened. Not enough to offer him a place to stay. Not enough to forget the years of being overlooked. But enough to look at him across that table and say, yeah, man, I made it. And you can, too. But no one's coming to save you. For the first time in our lives, we were eye to eye. About a month after meeting Mike, it happened. I got a call from a number I didn't recognize, and for once, I answered without thinking. It was the landlord of Dad's apartment building. Soft-spoken, awkward. He told me my dad had been found in his apartment after a neighbor called about the smell. No one had seen him in days. There it was. The ending I always saw coming, but never wanted to face. I went, of course. Not out of duty, not out of guilt, but because some part of me still needed to close the door properly. Walking into that apartment was like walking into a mausoleum of a life half-lived. There were old bills stacked on the kitchen counter, dusty photo frames with crooked smiles, an armchair that looked like it hadn't been sat in comfortably for years. And on the nightstand, next to his bed, was that same photo he'd sent me. Mom, Dad, and me. Not Mike. Just us. The funeral was small. Fewer than a dozen people came. Most of them neighbors who barely knew his name. Mike didn't show. I wasn't surprised. I gave the kind of eulogy you give when you're not sure what you're supposed to say. Honest but kind, measured but true. Afterward, standing alone by the grave, I felt a strange calm settle over me. There was no dramatic release, no tidal wave of grief. Just a quiet, solid understanding. It was over. And maybe, just maybe, I was free. On the walk back to my car, the sky cracked open in one of those Indiana spring rains that soaks you in seconds. I should have been frustrated, soaked shoes, wet clothes, ruined suit. But all I could do was laugh. Not bitter, not angry, just laugh. Because sometimes life hands you the storm you never asked for, and you come out standing anyway. After the funeral, I gave myself space to breathe, and I mean real space. I took a few days off work, turned off my phone, and drove out to Brown County. One of those places in Indiana where the trees seem to outnumber the people and the quiet settles around you like a blanket. I hiked a trail I hadn't been on in years, one Mom used to love when I was a kid. Back then, she'd pack a picnic, and we'd sit on a hilltop, laughing, swatting at mosquitoes, watching the world roll out under our feet. I remember how she used to ruffle my hair and say, "Someday you'll sit here with someone you love." Funny how life rewrites those memories. I sat there alone, knees drawn up, feeling the wind push through the trees, and for the first time, I talked to her. Not out loud, just in that quiet place inside myself I'd been ignoring for too long. I told her I was okay, that I'd survived, that I was done chasing the love that walked away, and that I was ready to stop apologizing for all the things I was never meant to fix. And in that moment, I swear, the ache in my chest loosened. By the time I drove home, the sun was dipping low, painting the world in gold. I didn't feel healed, not entirely. Life doesn't work that way, but I felt lighter, like maybe the ghosts could finally stay where they belonged, in the past. When I walked into my apartment, Sarah was waiting. She didn't pepper me with questions or tell me what I should feel. She just handed me a cup of tea, curled up beside me on the couch, and rested her head on my shoulder. That quiet closeness, that's what home is, I realized. Not a house, not a last name, not blood or duty. Home is the people who stay. I didn't expect much from the estate, and I was right. There was almost nothing left. A few old belongings, a life insurance policy so small it barely covered the funeral, and a handful of boxes. I went through them one rainy Sunday, sitting on my apartment floor, surrounded by the scraps of a man who had loomed so large in my life. There were pictures I'd never seen before, my mom holding me as a baby, my dad laughing in a way I barely remembered, one of the three of us camping by a lake somewhere. I found a letter, yellowed and folded at the bottom of a box. It was from my mom, written years ago, addressed to my dad. I almost didn't read it, but something pulled me in. She'd written about love, about forgiveness, about how she hoped he'd remember to show up for his son, to be present, to choose softness over pride. She wrote that grief makes people hard, but love is what makes them human again. I sat there for a long time, holding that letter like it was a lifeline from a woman I'd lost too soon. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger toward my dad. I felt sorrow. For what he missed. For the ways he couldn't bend. For the fact that he never got to hear me say, "I'm okay now." A few weeks later, I scattered the last of his things, donated what I could, kept a few photos, tucked that letter away in a drawer. And then I did something simple, something that felt small but was really everything. I called Mike. Not because I owed him, but because I wanted to. We met for coffee again. We didn't talk about the past, not much. We talked about now, about what comes next. And when we left, we shook hands, not as two boys tangled up in old family wars, but as two men who had survived them. Walking home that night, the sky was wide open, stars burning cold and clear above me. And for the first time in my life, I felt it in my bones. The world was mine to build, mine to belong to. Not because someone gave me permission, but because I had learned, at last, to give it to myself.